The other alternative, or another big alternative, is actually top Q learning, which is what you described.
Oh,
You basically take whichever thing had the most associated with it,
the most value. Okay, yeah, good.
the most value. And that works pretty well. Again, those are the kind of things that you would probably come up with if you just spend a little bit of time. Just say, well, what are the obvious things that you could do? Both of those make sense. It, of course, also has a problem. And that problem is that the agent, well, there's several problems, but one that isn't necessarily obvious is the agent that happens to have given the most Q value to a particular action may also give very nearly the same Q value to all the other actions as well. So it doesn't actually have a strong preference. It just happens to have put high value on everything. And so you're not really doing much for it either. Meanwhile, every other agent might, for example, like the second action for that particular agent. And so it makes a lot more sense to take the second action, but you can't because by a quirk of fate, the other action got slightly more value to it for just that one agent.
So it starts to feel a little bit like a negotiation.
Right, which is why there's something called negotiated W learning.
W learning.
So this is a lot more complicated, and I can't write it down in just a fancy little equation like that. But what negotiated W learning basically boils down to is the agent with the most to lose gets to figure out what the action is. So you sort of minimize loss rather than maximize an average or pick the best thing. So you look at the subagent. That basically what you do is instead of looking at the things that everyone thinks might be good and averaging them or doing a max over them, you look at the things where the difference between the big choice, the maximum choice, and the minimum choice are really large, and let that agent make a decision. And you sort of weight it across all of the actions. It can be arbitrarily complicated, but basically you don't want any agent to lose as opposed to having agents win. And all of these have their strengths and all of these have their weaknesses. And they're all very kind of cool, and under different circumstances, greatest mass makes sense. In other circumstances, top makes sense, and negotiated is good for other situations. And you can come up with lots of other things. The key thing is that you need to do arbitration. The problem with all of these, though, all of these methods and any other methods that you come up with is that they're terrible. And in fact, they're impossible. What does that mean, you say? Well,
what does that mean?
I'm going to summarize it simply this. The very first example you gave, you said, or the very first response that you gave to me when I described greatest mass Q learning is you said, oh, what you're really doing is you're voting.
And voting is definitely not impossible.
But as you know, there is an impossibility result for voting. And that is Arrow's impossibility result. And if you don't know what Arrow's impossibility result is for voting, then you need to stop what you're doing right now and go look it up.